Session number 2.
Thanks very much indeed. So I've been moved off of the main panel into a side seat, but largely because we have a panel of 5 great speakers, and so I just want to spend a minute or two kind of introducing the subject of the second session. So, title of the session: Benefits of Action: The Drivers Behind Success Stories. And I suppose that the paradox of the topic is on the one hand that it takes us from the last session, which, if you like, set out some of the landscape issues, into the much more specific opportunities and examples of progress being made on the ground. So it kind of takes us from a wide lens to a much more narrow lens, and we're challenged to go, it's this that's happening, it's that's happening, and this is why it's working. But on the other hand, we're challenged not to give, if you like, micro examples that are exemplary and should be celebrated, but don't necessarily have any scaled pathway. Yeah, so it challenges us not just to give good examples, but to show how success stories, drive, Chris's remaining 60% or 80% of those who are not part of those front-end leadership examples into action. So if I was, summarizing what this session is in terms of what we're trying to get out of it, is moving from landscape to specific. What are the examples, of where good practice on the ground, is capable of driving scaled change and dragging that rump of the business community, governments and countries that have as yet not fully as engaged as they could be going forward. We've got 5 excellent panelists to kick us off, more or less following the same lines as the last session. We'll take some opening comments and then go to the floor and take some remarks and observations from other participants. Georg, we're going to start with you, so if you could set the ball rolling, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Your Royal Highness, distinguished ministers, excellencies. Simon, against your good advice, I do feel obliged to make 2 general points, which I felt were missing in the first panel. I think the first one, I want to say that the theme of this session is just wonderful, creating a race to the sustainability top. I wish this were indeed also the title of the upcoming Rio+20 conference, because it sets the right mindset. How do we actually create the race to the top so that sustainability practices are rewarded and nurtured and supported? And one of my first answers to that would be a systemic one, which we can't avoid. We need to embrace openness and multilateral cooperation. Openness, trade, investment is the most effective way of diffusing technological solutions, and in the absence of openness, we cannot really achieve sustainable development. The biggest success stories in the last couple of years have to do with mobile telephony, technological change, and how rapidly it was applied around the world, and how helpful it has been in creating both societal benefits but also sustainable benefits directly. So the first point I would make is openness has to be part of the sustainability agenda, and with it comes, of course, good governance, because in the absence of incentives and the right enabling environment, openness and technological change cannot deliver. And the world is still massively imperfect in many places around the world. Transparency International will remind us that systemic corruption is in at least 70 countries, and in many countries there is government governance failure. And under such conditions, technological solutions cannot travel fast enough to have the benefit they could deliver. So good governance, I would suggest, also has a very important role to play for market solutions to make its due contribution. Innovation and technology, key to all we are doing and saying and thinking, and the best hope is in the future and in creating the solutions, and plenty of solutions already available. The clean tech market is estimated something around 1.7 trillion already, going to $2 trillion. The challenge is to grow it from $2 to $10 trillion. How do we grow the green market? How do we ensure that solutions are diffused rapidly, that we don't have barriers against the diffusion of green technology? Absolutely key. Then on the role of business itself, Chris was very generous with 20%. I buy it, not quite, but almost. According to our estimates, it's rather 10%. But going to 20%, and I think that's indeed the great opportunity. And how do we do it? One way is to create issue platforms where like-minded corporates can actually overcome systemic barriers. Water, low-carbon solutions, women empowerment, agriculture, sustainability. There are already huge platforms out there with hundreds of companies aligned from all countries around the world, who in their own practices are already integrating sustainability at the leadership level, at the operational level, in the value chain. But these companies are still a minority. They have not yet really made the march through the institutions. Most of the representative business associations are not yet sustainability associations. They rather lobby for something else. So we have to grow that share as rapidly as possible. And that is one way forward through smart incentives, encouragement, public-private partnerships. Many examples are out there. And here, probably the most relevant ones is for governments to be an enabler, to create the space for such voluntary complementary initiatives to grow and to complement what governments do or don't do. And here the complementary nature is very important, and I think it has proven in many places around the world that it can and must coexist, and one encourages the other. The hope is that over time, actually, enlightened voluntary leadership also encourages government leaders to be courageous themselves and to show leadership that is future-oriented and not just crisis management-oriented. So these are my 3 pennies contributions to this debate. First, I think openness for technological solutions to travel fast. Secondly, good governance, essential to overcome systemic barriers. There cannot be market-led solutions when there is no peace, when there is no enabling environment. And then how can we grow voluntary initiatives from 10% to 50% so it becomes a majority and actually also changes the political spectrum within the many countries and helps to grow this bottom-up, make the case for sustainability. Plenty of good examples already out there. We have to nurture them. We have to grow them. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Georg. We'll go straight on to Rachel.
Well, I think that as we talk about sort of inclusive green growth as the pathway to sustainable development, I think we have to, is this working? Sorry. Hi, sorry. As we talk about all this conversation around inclusive green growth as the new growth pattern towards sustainable development, I think we first of all have to be comfortable with each country starting where they are, which means that, you know, the decision matrix for a developed country is different from that for a BRIC, is different from that for a fast-growing economy, is different for a low-income economy, different for a fragile state. But everybody could make a start. And, you know, I think we have to get comfortable with sort of menus for transition, which means that, you know, there are going to be some suboptimal decisions on the way towards an optimal transition. So, you know, we calculated together with the IMF last year in the preparation for the G20 in Cannes that there are $400 billion worth of fuel subsidies, which if they were removed, would give you, you know, a little bit more to play with. You can either redistribute that within the economy if that's the way you want to go, or you can use that funding for other forms of incentive, for technology, for different forms of safety nets, etc. But we also know that there's right way and wrong way to do it. So Iran, not often used as an example of good practice, removed its fuel subsidies in an extremely smooth way by concentrating on a massive information campaign about why fuel subsidies did not benefit the poor and that the removal of them was actually in the benefit of the poor. You can contrast that with some other countries who famously moved very quickly to remove subsidies for all the right reasons, but without being able to persuade the population that this was actually going to be in their interest. So we've got to be able to tailor solutions country by country. But, just to spice it up a little bit, Simon, I would disagree a little bit with our sort of linear approach here. I mean, and not to pick on Georg, but Georg said that, there's no sort of ability for markets to work, in the absence of peace and democracy. I mean, that's a fallacy. In a conflict country, private sector activity is what keeps that country together. It just goes underground. And our ability to, post-conflict, work with whoever's been there and bring them up and put in place the fundamentals of access to market, the ability for small, medium companies to start trading, etc. These become the essential building blocks. So nobody can't start the pathway towards inclusive and green growth. And I think that we just sort of categorize linear approaches in a way that isn't particularly necessarily always helpful. Now, just my final point in terms of how to get this sort of race to the top going. The role for public policy is to set the floor, is to set the conditions for an investment climate that the private sector should operate into. But too often our investment climate work and our focus on regulation is any old private sector activity. I think that helping countries, especially developing countries, to set the conditions which would make it pay to be best practice means a more sophisticated set of regulation and administrative approaches. I think we also, as we heard yesterday, need to get over this voluntary principles versus regulation. Voluntary principles often go ahead of regulation. The private sector moves ahead of the public sector for lots of good reasons. And then this iterative process of the public sector then ratcheting up, confirming that that is practice that they want to see, and then letting the private sector go beyond. But at the moment when it is cheaper to be illegal, let alone legal, let alone best practice, then public policy needs to attack the subsidies and the misappropriation of regulation that makes it extremely difficult for best practice to survive. There are examples of going to scale. The Loess Plateau in China 30 years ago was a barren desert. Today it is a productive landscape that keeps millions of people food secure, keeps millions of people in jobs, has watershed management and is sustainable. That kind of program is now replicated in miniature in Rwanda and will be across East Africa. So we can actually transform and take back the environment and make it work for people and make it work for the economy. And so I am optimistic about this, but the role of public policy in setting the floor and then not constraining the private sector to raise the ceiling seems to be the key. And that will be different in every country depending on where they are.
And would you draw a particular, as you did with Iran, a particular example of a country that has moved effectively, particularly, say, amongst the more rapidly emerging economies, that has moved more effectively in establishing a policy environment that, if you like, encourages companies to benefit from the right thing?
Yeah, I mean, Chico Catani is not here, but I mean, I think, Brazil gets a lot of attention because perfection has not been achieved, but they've achieved extraordinary good. And one way of doing that has been the alignment within the public-private debate in Brazil of interest in the private sector and the public sector in the advancement of Brazil, which can only happen on the basis of the stewardship of natural resources. Is it easy? Do they get it right every time? No. But I think you have a banking sector, you have a banking regulator, you have a national development bank, you have productive manufacturing and heavy industry from the oil sector to gas, to agriculture, all actually struggling with how to make Brazil sustainable. And I think that should be celebrated and supported rather than everybody trying to pick off the little bits that don't seem to work.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Frank, can I move on to you? Please.
Thank you. I think this panel is a call to action. For the last 4 years or more, there's been some level of awareness about the sustainability challenge, and there's been a lot of action, but we seem to be stuck somehow. And 60 days before, or less than that, before the Rio+20 summit, we still haven't got it together. So, in spite of a lot of action, I just wanted to share with you a reflection. What has happened? In this year, economic analyses are more sophisticated, we have scientific advances, policy frameworks and mechanisms, communications to deliver messages to people that were not thought about years before, and in spite of some gaps, stronger institutions to deliver results. So why is it that in spite of all action, we're not there yet? I think it's time for us to ask ourselves, are we really representing the interests of the people we work for? Are we playing the role as leaders that we need to at this stage in time and humanity? Do our actions really represent the values that we speak for? Or are we being distracted by political or economic interests that really derail us from our tasks? This is a moment of uncertainty. And leadership is about enabling others to achieve their purpose under conditions of uncertainty. So we need to lead people into the unknown, because people do the best they can with the conditions that they have. And sustainability entails adopting change and adapting to change. As leaders, we must show the way to our communities as to which values to maintain, which ones to change, which ones have to be eliminated, and which ones need to be included. We need to be willing to trust ourselves, trust others. We need to be willing to fail. And in countries like Colombia or the countries in which there's poverty, we need to be willing to enable people, to empower people, so they're part of the solution, even to the extent to which we can become irrelevant. We need to be willing not only to distribute good news, but to distribute costs and responsibilities, for example, to the private sectors. So the barriers that we're facing today and the barriers that we're facing in the Rio+20 issue today are not economic, technical, or political. They're just manifestations of deeper issues. We might be trapped in our roles. We might be confusing our roles with what we are as individuals. We might have forgotten about human dignity and working for peoples that don't have a voice. So this, before action, I would encourage us to reflect and to have vision, to imagine something that is greater for all, to have curiosity to understand why things have not worked so far and how can they work moving forward, to have disposition to understand different perspectives and to reconcile those, to have character to make decisions and set the limits, even if some group of interest don't like it, to have the discipline to execute and follow up with method, and to have the generosity to allow others that have not yet been born to rejoice in the fruits of our labor. And after that reflection, we must act now because there's a sense of urgency.
Thank you. Maybe in the second round, Minister, we can come back then to the sort of the second part of the paragraph, if you like, which is building on that. Where does one take that action agenda, and perhaps drawing one or two examples from your own work and leadership. Minister, please.
Thank you very much. You used the picture of a race towards the top. And what is important in a race? One, it's pretty important to know where you're going. So a clear vision of where we are going is a good idea. Secondly, it's pretty important to start moving. Action now, yes. And thirdly, it's pretty important to get the players on the scene to understand what the game is about and to get them to compete in the right way. So this would be the image of the race that I would see as the framework for the discussion today. Good. For the first thing, the vision, where are we going right now? Actually, when I talk to a lot of people which have been doing it lately, we are starting to have the same vision of the end target. Call it whatever you like. Call it inclusive green economy, inclusive green growth, sustainable development. it is a clear understanding that the 3 pillars of sustainability, environment, social, and economic, cannot be taken apart. They are not pillars, they are a DNA that's twisted together. If you lose one, you lose the others, or the problems come back to you. So as Minister for the Environment, I think we need to change environment policies from being fighting against the economic forces, trying to limit damage, to actually work with the economic forces and realize that development, eradication of poverty and economic growth is only possible if we make this transition to a new economy. Why? Because the brown economy, the present economy, well, I don't need to say more about that. You told me not to go into analysis. I think we all know that we're going to hit the wall pretty fast. We'll be going out of the track with a race. We will just hit the fence if we continue with brown economy. So we need to move towards green economy. So how do we get people to move? We do that with goals, with targets and actions underneath the goals. I'm completely aware we cannot have one size fits all, but we need to start setting some targets in different contexts. So we could set some targets in my country as a developed countries. We could set different targets in other countries to spur that we start moving towards this vision. I think that would be the least that we should expect for Rio, that we have a common vision, we have goals, and we start a process where we set targets so that we all start moving. Thirdly, we have to set the targets on some areas, because otherwise we will keep moving in this semantic area where we say, oh, is it sustainable development or is it inclusive green economy? No, let's get down into substance. So what are we talking about right now when we are talking about the problems? We are talking about energy, access to the right kind of sustainable energy. We're talking about water, that we all need water for survival, for production, for agriculture. We're talking about oceans. We're talking about we live off these oceans. We all share them. We're talking about the land that we share and the ecosystems on the land. And we're talking about resources and waste. This is 5 areas that we all share, that we all have the same problems with, and that we need to set targets within those 5 areas. If we do that, if we start to move into the substance and discuss that, then we get the actors to come, because then they know what we're talking about. Right now, the actors out there, they're like, what is this exercise about? What are you talking about? If we start to set these goals, if we start to say where we're going, we can get the actors to engage. We can get the young people. We can get the businesses, the private sector. We can get the city level, all the new actors on the scene that we need to get moving in the right direction. We can get them moving. So I think it's a good, strong image, but we really need to be concrete. And I've proposed, from the EU side, we're starting to talk about these 5 areas. It could be others, I think, but I think at least it's hard to say we don't share water, energy, land, oceans, and that they are actually causing us a lot of problems and are right now limits to growth. So instead of considering these as limits to growth, we need to handle them in a way so that they enable us to grow. We will have no growth in the future unless we make this transition towards a green economy, inclusive green economy, in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication.
I've now moved from this image of a race to the top to this crash that you described, which is difficult. But I just wanted to ask one follow-on question. So if we relate the goals and targets not so much to a company, which I'll come on to in a second, but more to a nation, a city, or indeed multiple nations, Rio, how does one build credibility into that process? How does one convince one's own constituencies that the pain of setting targets at such a high level, is worthwhile?
We talk too much about pain for too long. So we need to show the positive visions. And in Copenhagen, I can show you an example of inclusive green economy. We have the harbor, or it's the same thing in Sweden. You can swim in the harbor. We lifted a whole area, which was socially really, really uninteresting. House prices went up, investments came to that area, and so we have the social, the economic, and the environmental side pretty clear. But I can also give you an example where in Kenya, I visited this village where they got a water pump driven by solar panels, PV. And they had, then you pay with your cellular phone. Everybody, even the poorest people have a cellular phone. You get a little chip, so you put some money on that one and you go and get the water. So the environmental side is clear. It was not driven by diesel, it was PV. You saved about 40% water. Secondly, the economic side, pretty interesting, no corruption because everybody can see where the money is flowing. The young men could buy the water at 3 shillings a liter and sell it at 10 in the next village and create a small economy and actually a living. And thirdly, the social side, which is the most beautiful side, is that the women and the children, they didn't have to walk 10 miles before they started their work or before they went to school to get water. And even more beautiful, which I personally as a woman really enjoy, that when men's job become women's job, they lose status. I think most of us have seen that. But when women's job get a little chip and some technology, they get status. So they actually got all the men to start getting the water in that city, which I think is pretty strong. So this is another image of inclusive green economy or social sustainable development encompassing all three. Why not talk about that instead of always talking about the pain? I mean, maybe it's better to give them loans to have a water pump like that than to give them loans to keep paying fossil fuels at a too low cost.
Okay. I'm just going to go back along the panel briefly to Minister Pearl. Can I come back to you just for 1 second? Because I know that the subject of goals and targets is very close to your heart, particularly in the context of Rio. And it would be great just to get a kind of feel for you on the same question, kind of how can the setting of a new architecture of goals, as the previous minister has said, really be convincing, be compelling, and drive change?
We think the Sustainable Development Goals are a mechanism to achieve some objectives in which we, on paper, are on agreement. And there will be a mechanism by which each country voluntarily could subscribe to them. They're not in conflicting with the Millennium Development Goals, but they complement those. They address key areas in which all of us are in agreement, or most of us are in agreement, that need to be addressed. And they will be a tool for countries to implement specific policies. For example, in Colombia, we have a problem with cattle and greenhouse emissions. And there's 4 elements that we need to take into account when defining specific policies. First of all, we need to include the community. Second, the private sector. Third, academy or scientists. And then, of course, government. The Sustainable Development Goals will allow us, for example, in the case of Colombia, to perfection a mechanism of silvopastoral initiatives by which the production of cattle is increased by 5 times, the use of soil is optimized, the use of water, the use of fertilizers, and the income of cattle ranchers is increased. But more than that, community is able to have ownership of their own process of taking care of the environment. So the Sustainable Development Goals are overarching mechanism that each country will, by its own means, as Rachel said, will have to detail according to its own reality, because there is not a cookie-cutter approach. But we need goals because what is not measured cannot be improved.
Great. Mr. Persson, just bear with me for 2 seconds longer, if you will. I know. Simon, I just wanted to bring you in from the OECD, and just, you've heard a series of stories here, all very upside, very positive, quite rightly so. Help us understand through the work that the OECD has been doing on green economy, the cost-benefit sort of story that you've worked on now extensively. Is what you're hearing from the panel matching what your analytics is telling you, or if not, in what ways?
Well, we're an evidence-based organisation, so...
Is your button on?
We're an evidence-based organisation, Simon, and we live in the realms of the dismal science. And so everything which is measurable today, which is the old economy, and the things that we have valued, as distinct from the things we haven't, will tell you that change is costly. And so I'd say that it's very important in all of this to be quite upfront and honest about the costs, but also to match them with the benefits that we know that are there in some cases. And I mean, let's not get away from this. The principal costs are in moving out of the status quo. It's that a dynamic of change is hard to initiate, and just having a goal and telling people that it's good for them, I don't think is going to be enough. You do need to look at where the costs are. Now, in some cases, those are distributional costs, which you can have schemes for undoing. Several of you have mentioned fossil fuels. Okay, you remove the subsidy for fossil fuels on the consumption side, you can find ways of redistributing that money backwards. There will be some losers, but you can protect a lot of people. But you can't protect everybody. On the production side, I mean, OECD economies are burdened with trillions of dollars of physical capital, which hasn't yet been written off, and the owners of that are going to fight you if you decide to devalue it. If you own resources in the ground from which you can extract rents, they're not going to sit back. They're going to lobby to maintain the value. So it is, I think we need to be realistic about this, and we need to be plotting a course that can move us out of the status quo to try to minimize the costs, and also match them and put the benefits alongside. Now, the benefits, we've done some interesting work on benefits. And yeah, just to take the climate one, go through to 2050, try to aim for 450 parts per million, use first best policies, and we reckon that the rate of growth would be 0.2 percentage points per annum less than it would otherwise be. So the world's economy would still quadruple. But we almost certainly understate the benefits, because we know that in many developing countries, the cost-benefit ratio is 10 times the benefits for removing particulate from air. So there are health benefits. Similarly, with respect to water, sanitation, very significant benefits. They're not always being pulled together in the right place. So I'm one for being reasonably hard-headed about this. I don't like, I have to say, race to the top, because the truth is the race is starting from every country starting from a different point, and the costs and the benefits are all different. But I don't think we help anybody by not encouraging them to look in a very cold, clear way at what those are, and you have to pick your path through them. There are better paths and not so good paths. Somebody mentioned at the back here, you know, handing out free permits, for instance, if you are running an emissions permit system. This actually hands a huge gift to the very people that you want to change. So you need to look at the techniques. But I mean, I think goals, that's fine. You need to know where you're going, but you also need to be very clear about the cost and benefits. You can't avoid that.
Great, but not so dismal after all. I mean, a lot of upside in what you're describing. Thank you. Thank you for being patient, Mr. Pearson. Let me come back to you. I actually want to start with a sort of a Volvo question. You know, it's kind of Volvo's kind of been around for a long time. We don't need to go into its detailed history, but you know, your predecessor, as I understand it, was kind of also one of the leadership CEOs that was sort of around at the time when this journey internationally began. Yeah, and at that point, Volvo was talking about mobility and environment. You know, you were already in that discussion. And I guess I'm curious to know, in the light of a lot of these points that have been made, you know, has that context really changed? You know, do you see a land change in the conversation, or, you know, are we sort of pottering along having similar discussions at this point?
I think for us, 40 years ago was very important, because up until then, since the 1920s, we had two core values in the Volvo Group. It was quality and safety. But after the Stockholm conference 40 years ago, we added the care for the environment as a core value for the group. And that had an amazing impact on the group when it comes to actually directing investments, addressing some of the points that we have heard from the panel today. Also having a focus on how to get to the solutions that is needed. And perhaps most importantly for the company was to have a realization for ourselves that we were part of the problem, but also creating a huge fighting spirit and competitiveness to not only be part of the solution, but actually lead the solutions and implement the solutions. And that over the years has taken expression in many different examples. And if we want to talk about the race to the top and also have good examples coming out of it, we started already in the 70s with, in Brazil with Curitiba to implement bus rapid transport systems that was actually sustainable not only from the environment point of view, but also from a social and from an economic point of view. A few years ago, we decided to invest quite a lot of money in our Ghent factory to make it CO2 neutral, to show that you actually can get CO2 neutral production facilities in assembly of the trucks. And we did it, and coming back to Simon's comments, we actually got a very good payback of it. It was a huge investment, we got a good payback, and we showed not only our employees, but also the society that we were living in Ghent, that you can actually do that if you put your targets and goals and focus onto it. And finally, in 2007, we lined up 7 identically outside trucks, or they looked identically on the outside, but inside, all the engines, all the drivelines were different, and they were all on the alternative fuel, electromobility, hybrids, and so on and so forth. And standing in front of these 7 trucks, you basically could say that technology is one thing. Technology is moving on, and technology we as a company needs to take care of, and we do, and we have done, investing a lot in those companies, in technologies. But you start to realize that you need to have a market. You need to create a market for those products in order to fully utilize the benefit of these new technologies that we in the industry has developed. And there I think it's a huge challenge for the industry, for the society, but also of course for the customers to create that. And in order to really further emphasize how important we believe this is in a corporation, we have changed this year our vision to now become a world leader in sustainable transportation. And we actually then follow the real definition of sustainability. And we also have joined the WWF Climate Savers Program in order to take commitments and really showing that the vision that we have and the mission that we have is not only words on the PowerPoint, but we actually translate it into hard fact and hardcore investments, and that is then driving this, because we believe this will be a competitive advantage going forward, and that's also very important. Coming back to your point there, it's what is now needed in order to practically move this forward, and I think one thing we have been talking about was the smart incentives last time. I think that in order to create economically viable markets that have the size that makes it economically producible, we need incentives, and we need them initially to get things going. I think that, but I have to be smart and rightly. Something that we as a global company are missing, and we really want to focus on, and especially in this forum, is harmonization on the legislation and the standards in order to create the volume that is needed for us to produce this new technology on a broad scale and then get a full impact and potential out of it. I talked about that we need to get all the 3 actors together, society, industry, and customers. And in order to do that, we need also to have help in focus R&D efforts. We are taking on, and that's our responsibility, our investments to take the technology as far as our products concerned, but to binding this together with efficient transport systems. That's something that we need to have really hard focused and clear R&D activities in order to make. And finally, we have to have something in our transport system in the tanks. Might be electricity, might it be alternative fuel, biofuel, biogas, or whatever. And in order to get that to work in a practical way, we need investments in distribution and production of these renewable fuels. So I think in all, it has happened a huge amount over the last 40 years, both for us as a company and in society. There are millions and millions of good examples, which I see when I travel around the world. And I just think that we really need to have a clear-cut focus on the big drivers and the big changes that we have. Then, of course, I represent a small part of what you as ministers and delegates need to take care of. But for us, of course, the transport system and the transporting of people is a little bit of the lifeblood in the society. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. let me open it out to the floor and perhaps take a few additional remarks and comments. Yes, please. Let's start with you, Minister.
Thank you. I felt I should also have a contribution on creating a race to sustainability. I think as politicians, as government, we've got a responsibility that we create an environment that is conducive to encourage communities to do things from themselves so that they take charge of their own lives through the projects that we can do. And with those projects, you find that you don't just come and, and say, I've got a project, here's a project. It comes by engaging the communities. You find that they will sort of indicate, you find that they know what they want. And when you develop from there, they develop ownership of the project, and the project becomes very sustainable. I will give an example of one of our projects that we are doing on working for water, that deals with alien invasive species. And I know it's becoming a problem not only in South Africa, but the whole of Africa. The rivers are drying up, and also the fields, when you plant, these plants come in, the lakes and the rivers are covered with these alien invasive species. So with that type of a project, you are assisting the community to protect the biodiversity. The rivers will run again when you are cleaning up the rivers. But those alien invasive species, you do something out of them. You are giving them skills. They do, for instance, carpentry. They will be doing desks, tables, and other things. They even do, some of them are even medicinal. I'm talking of projects that we are doing already in the country, that now we've got a section that is doing medicine that is proved by the medical world that they do work those medicines. Now, you are giving them, you are empowering them as they are cleaning. Others are becoming carpenters, others are becoming producers of others. But on the other hand, you are developing entrepreneurs. Some now, we encourage them that they own those businesses, and then they enter into the business world. So that's how the project becomes sustainable. That's how you are scaling them, encouraging them, eradicating poverty. So I'm just giving one of the programs that it really was Adopt a River, that we are targeting women. They adopt a river, we teach them basic skills of water testing. They research themselves, why is this river polluted? And they start to say, it's because of 1, 2, 3. The municipality is not collecting waste, so-and-so is not doing this, and they keep it clean. But they don't end up there. They use the water for food security. And when they grow the vegetables, now they have to add value to the vegetables. It's a smaller company. You talk to these big companies to train them, to give them the technology. They start preserving, making frozen foods or tinned foods and others. So those are some of the examples that if we can create sustainable livelihood for our people, for eradication of poverty, and also to taking charge of their lives. And those projects become very sustainable because they see the profits that are there. Thank you.
And Minister, can I just ask you a short follow-on question, which is, it's a fantastic example of making stuff happen on the ground, and explaining how and why it happens on the ground. Does that, how can those processes benefit from an international framework and an international process that we're all involved in here?
They do benefit because, for instance, the one that I say they develop their own, they can add value to what they're producing, those women. I met some of their products in another country that it was labeled to show that other countries are now importing, they're able to export what they're doing. The project of conservation of indigenous medicinal trees, they were now exporting some of the oils that they're producing from those trees because we partnered them with Oils for Africa. So they benefit other countries. Other countries also learn that we have got, South Africa has got certain medicines that we don't know of, that that we didn't use. So international community benefits from what comes from a developing country, Africa. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Please, Goran.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to contribute a little bit with within our global Coca-Cola framework that I work for, contribute a little bit what we're trying to do locally and actually in getting action and moving ahead. There are two aspects that we're doing. We joined a local network of local and international companies in Sweden called the Haga Initiative, which has very ambitious climate goals. The overall goal for the Haga Initiative is to reduce, for the members, this carbon footprint by 40% to 2020. Actually, locally, we set ourselves a target of 80%, and from our starting point, we already reduced our carbon footprint with 35% since 2004. But the important thing, I think, with the initiative is that we try to approach this from the opportunity end. It's so easy to get stuck in the lowest common denominator. And many of the core skills which are fundamental to this are inherent in successful businesses and good businesses, because it's about, as Mr. Persson said, setting an objective, making a philosophy a way of life, setting objectives, making plans, execute the plans, follow up the goals, change the plans when they don't work, and go on. And that's core skills of companies. And we tend to forget that an important piece of business and making a profit is actually to manage scarce resources in a wise way. You can't successfully run a business if you're not managing scarce resources. And that's important, and that's core skills of companies that we tend to forget when we approach the environmental challenge or opportunity. The other thing, as an example that we have done, although at the beginning is a bit difficult, is to take the approach for areas which is important to us to be a demanding customer. We have set ourselves that, as for everyone, fossil fuel is going to be is a finite resource. We need to proactively move away from it. The same goes with plastics. We're now into 25% in part of our bottles. Actually PET that comes from renewable sources. So that means that renewables is an important quality aspect when we buy services or when we buy raw materials, as we do with any other input to our production. And thus we're now today in our transportation up to 80% in renewable fuels. And we continue to push there. Demand drove actually gasoline stations in our neighborhood together with other companies that are located in the same sites as us, who now help us sell rapeseed oil-based biodiesel. So we're strong believers in demand-driven environmental issues, being demanding customers. Finally, on that subject, where governments can help in this race also is, as was already said, harmonized rules across countries, but also at times very selectively help subsidize new areas, just in order to help them gain scale. And when scale is there, business should manage it themselves.
And you almost took the last question I was going to ask you kind of away from me, which relates to government, but it was a question more about Rio, which is not so much a standard-setting process in the sense that you're meaning it, which is how can that process not just help a leadership company such as Coca-Cola, but help to bring the rest of the sector into play? The kind of the Chris question from the first, from the first round. It's absolutely crucial that leadership companies kind of show how to do it, and that involves all kinds of pieces for Coke as it does for many others. But how can Rio bring the rest into play is really the big question.
One, I think, is just by being an example and try to tell about what we're doing, helping understand that it's not rocket science. The other thing, actually, I believe is, again, by commonly together with other business and being inspirational in that sense, being demanding customers in terms of the input to what we do, is actually an example that actually can help get critical mass on it. Because it's always a question of getting critical mass of everything you want to do. So that could be two examples.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. I'm going to take two more questions, or two more comments. Ms. Greenspan?
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to bring emphasis in 2 points that are not only in expanding markets or getting prices right, but also the possibility of changing behavior through social programs. And I think that India and Brazil have very good examples of how to do that. For example, in Brazil, you have the whole program of conditional cash transfers that have been developed to what they call green bolsa verde. So they are changing behavior of the farmers by giving them cash transfers according to certain sets of behavior with respect to agriculture, land, etc. So it's not only getting prices right in the market or subsidies in the market, it's also changing behavior by social programs. The same happens in India, for example, with the employment guarantee scheme in the rural areas, where they have incorporated into the scheme, behaviors that are sustainable in terms of farming and etc. So I think that if we are serious about talking about not only the economics, but also the social and the environment coming together, also social programs can have a very important influence in changing behavior and fostering sustainable practices. My second point is with respect to governance, because I think that that was a point that was made, and I think that is essential. And it's true that we need the legal and the regulations, etc. But we have to understand also that to help developing countries to have the right governance, the right government framework, we will need also to make different institutional arrangements for sustainable development. We don't have the institutions in the present governments many times to really take the agenda of sustainable development forward. So we will need to invest in institutional arrangements, in capacity building, in knowledge and exchange platforms for them to learn how to have the right policy framework and foster, sustainable development.
So can I just, without going too deeply because of time limitations, kind of push you slightly? I mean, that's, capacity development, governance arrangements. I mean, boil that into something that a normal bloke understands. Give an example or something.
Let me give you the example of Kenya, okay? We started with Kenya in the discussion on their planning processes to incorporate sustainable development goals and objectives. And we developed there an institution for sustainable energy because they didn't have anything for sustainable energy. There was nobody that knew how to do that. There was no map for what was the potential for sustainable energy in the country, et cetera, et cetera. What happens now is that they have a geothermal institution that is fostering geothermic energy, and the World Bank is coming, IFC is coming now to scale up the investment. The regulations are there, the institutions are there, they have the public servants that know how to do it and what to do, and now the private sector can come into that framework and scale up the investment for wind and geothermal that they didn't have before.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Final point, please, Ms. Esperance.
Thank you. I'm Matilda. I'm a parliamentarian for the Social Democrats and also chairman on the Committee on Environment and Agriculture in Parliament. Thank you for good, interesting points making here. I would like to add a few things. I think we all agree that we've got common but different responsibilities. I also think that all of us sitting here, we have our own homework to do. I think if we look upon ourselves, we know that we could have done more than we're doing today. For Sweden example, I think we have a homework to do when it comes to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. I think we have a homework to do when it comes to scale up renewable investments or environmental friendly investments. And it would be interesting to hear the panelists elaborate a little bit about what's their homework, and is it something that they think that they could bring into the negotiations in Rio that actually could be something that we set common targets on. I think, for example, on the World Bank, still handing out loans to coal plants instead of cheaper solar and wind energy and so on. So it would be a little bit interesting to hear the panelists saying a little something on what's their homework, and is it something that they could bring into the negotiations. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And that sort of half certainly I can carry through into the last question I have for the panel, so thank you for teeing that up, actually. That's very helpful. So last round, ladies and gentlemen. I think the question, it might be about homework. I think that would be a fair way of framing it. But I think it's how can one use leadership practice to demonstrate the benefits of the transformations that are needed in the discussions and negotiations in Rio? Not what example now, but how can one really structurally get beyond the illustration to give a sense of confidence to those that are not in the leadership role, that moving forward more rapidly, moving forward at scale, will make sense to them as nations, as communities, in many different ways. And perhaps we'll go in sort of a reverse run, if we can, from Mr. Pearson, from yourself all the way across to Georg. If I can ask you, just for the purpose of time, perhaps to limit your conclusions to about a minute.
I think from my point of view, and I'm definitely not an expert how to create that leadership, but if I take my own example and the company I'm in, one key success factor is actually to create this focus and making sure that the focus is not spread out on too much. And in our case, it's 3 core values. We take our investments decision based on is it aligned with or not with our core values. If it's not, then we don't do it. And we can, of course, be in a situation there. But when it comes to actually driving change and also making sure that change are implemented and the leadership is there, it is, of course, a focus is of great importance in order to be able to measure, be able to see the impact and so on and so forth.
Okay. Thank you very much. Minister.
Well, I was pretty inspired by Louisa in the previous panel, who said that politicians are there to make the difficult decisions so we can make people make the easy decisions. And I think that should be a reminder for everyone who's making decisions that we should make the difficult decisions, but do it with a long-term perspective so that we show people that the difficult decisions are the right decisions. That's about being a leader, that's about being visionary. That is to show people this might look tough tomorrow, but this will improve your life substantially in a while from now. This needs to be explained differently in many, many different contexts. In a developed country like mine, we talk a lot about resource efficiency. Why? Because it's something that ministers of finance understand. It's something that heads of states understand. It's something that actually normal people understand, that it's good not to waste a whole lot. I mean, everybody can understand that it is. In Europe, we lose about 40% of our water in the systems. That doesn't make sense. So it's economically unsound, and it's, for normal people, waste in a way that they don't morally accept. So you can actually talk about that. This is resource efficiency. You can talk about a security issue to actually ensure that we have the resources that we need for our well-being in the years to come. If we don't have phosphate, we cannot make agriculture. If we don't have materials like the rarest materials or metals, we cannot build what we want to build. We cannot create the technology that we want. On the other hand, if we become really good at using these in the right way, we will have a competitiveness that will make us be able to sell something, to export, to create new jobs for people. So this is, of course, this is, in my context, the way I would explain it, so that we make the difficult decisions. And I can spend a lot of time telling people what will happen if we don't do it. But my experience is, as politicians, we've talked a whole lot about worst case scenarios, and they're just moving towards us, right? We're just following the worst curves ever. So that obviously are not really moving people. So we need to talk about also the benefits of the actions that we make. And one last thing to the companies. you need to get environment all the way into your business model, because it's good to come some of the way and to help society, but you need to get it into your business model. For instance, I'm pretty shocked that some of the largest windmill producers in the world are not thinking about their windmills as assets. They should hold on to the resources and not sell a windmill, but maybe sell sustainable energy 20 years from now, so that they can bring the windmill back, take all their materials apart, use them again for a new and cleverer windmill in the next generation. I think car producers could do the same thing. Why not sell the function of transport instead of selling a car? You need the materials in some years from now, looking at resource prices. So I think companies need to get environment all the way into the business model and not just eliminate waste, but actually think about that they, from the design of their products, need to rethink how they can conserve the materials and not pollute them, but get them used in a way so that they can be reused again and again. So that's, to quote the Chinese minister Wen Jiabao, who said, a circular economy. And this is really to get environment into the hearts of economic policies, but also into the hearts of business models. Sorry, it was a little long.
Thank you very much. Just fine. Mr. Pearl.
In our case, the challenge is different because, unfortunately, and to our shame, about 30 or 35% of the Colombian population are poor. So what we want collectively is to change people's conduct. But we cannot treat people that are striving to survive in the same way of those that, for example, belong to large companies in the private sector. So for the first group, which it's our priority, of course, we need to create a set of incentives so that they have the willingness to change their conduct, but knowing that they will be better off. So these projects need to not only include environmental goals, but also have the primary goal of decreasing poverty. As we select those projects, it's important for us, and what has worked is to select projects that have larger impact and they're easy to implement. They might not be the priorities, but we need to set examples and build credibility. As communities gather together around projects that have credibility, other communities might want to come in. And as for the private sector, then we have to take tough decisions and ask the private sector to really be honest in what entails for them, what is their legacy as business people in countries like Colombia. They need to invest more, they need to put more, so that as a society we're going to be better off. Thank you very much. Rachel.
So I've got a couple of points, and I'd like the right of reply as well, so if you don't mind. First of all, I think goals are important in putting a flag in the sand and giving people something to rally around. But I think we have to learn the lesson of the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals did not lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty since 1990. Sustained economic growth did. What the Millennium Development Goals did is give people a focus to rally around, making sure that growth had an impact for the positive aspects that we agreed upon, whether it's maternal health or access to water, etc. And so I think that as we have this conversation around goals and sustainable development, we really need to get serious about what are the goals that we're trying to set, which are a proxy for the kind of inclusive and green development or green growth that we want to have. So, and I think we have to be careful, especially as Europeans, because I think we can set a goal over the next 10 years to say that 40% of fish for food should be coming from sustainable aquaculture. But, you know, that would really mean reform of the common fisheries policy as well as the common agriculture policy. So I think, you know, walking our own talk becomes terribly important after 20 years since Rio. The second thing is to go to speed and scale, which I think is what we all want. Institutions do matter. I mean, you've heard from Coca-Cola, you've heard from Volvo, and I was trying to make the same point, which is that there will always be first movers. First movers can set alight competitiveness within their sector, but to help everybody move along, then you need to have regulation. Regulation demands institutions, and it demands a certain kind of governance. And so we can't ignore the fact that we need institutions on the public policy side to be that partner for the private sector. The third thing is, let's strike where we've got agreement. You want leadership? Colombia, the UK, others are running national capital accounting alongside their GDP. We've got at least 6 to 10 countries already did it. Why can't 50 countries just stand up in Rio and say we're doing it and we're doing it now? We've been talking about the methodology for 40 years. There are huge technical resources working on a common methodology. Anybody who wants to can stand up in Rio. We'll provide you with a platform. The UK is going to be there as well, and others, and you can join. And at the same time, companies are going to join as well, because there's already a massive movement within the private sector around their own accounting, linked to the need for government to allow for a different set of evidence and a different data set to be in the cabinet room in order to frame budget decisions differently. My homework is to communicate better why we have to work with countries where they are. We've come under attack for occasionally financing coal. In the last 7 years, we've financed $41 billion worth of energy investments, of which less than $3 billion have been for coal. Why? Because for certain countries, their transition to a greener and more inclusive growth demands that they burn coal cleanly in that transition. To not do so means they are making a choice between energy access for all and climate change. And climate change is not, it's not one or the other. It's about development, but development that can be more inclusive and greener. So the latest issue is about Kosovo. So nobody has invested in Kosovo in the last 12 years, any form of energy generation, clean or otherwise. Right? That's a failing of the international community and an indictment of what happens when you don't have institutions, and you don't have peace, and you don't have prosperity. But if Kosovo is going to have energy access for more people and therefore guarantee the kinds of peace and prosperity that we invested so much in the 90s to begin to achieve, then we have to provide energy. Well, the gas from Russia is not going to arrive for 10 years. There's nothing else coming in. The hydro is not there. And climate change makes hydro in the Western Balkans even more difficult. Yes, there is opportunity for wind and there is opportunity for solar, but it's not load-bearing. And Kosovo and Serbia sit on massive amounts of filthy lignite. So the question is, can we burn that lignite cleanly? The least worst option. But can we burn it more cleanly than they are currently burning it, making hundreds of thousands of children ill every year, as a transition towards hopefully gas, hopefully hydro, hopefully new technology. Those are the really difficult trade-offs that every country has to make based on where they are today and where they want to be in the future. And occasionally that means we're on the wrong side of the equation for some people.
Brilliant, Rachel, thank you. Georg, last word to you.
Well, thank you. That's a real privilege. I do believe we are in a difficult period where building global consensus forward-looking is not easy to be achieved. I think Rio is a wonderful opportunity to build momentum bottom-up again. And many of the examples we heard today speak to the importance of supporting innovation on the ground and looking for winning solutions and exploring how through partnerships and collaboration, both global and locally, we can give more impetus and thereby also encourage policymakers to move soon as well. In the end, we all need global leadership and we all need to rebuild and work towards this. I think the good news is also that the geography of sustainability innovation has migrated all around the world. Technology is accessible from many parts now, and we heard of great examples, and there are also many more examples of collaboration where private sector not only individually proves its commitment to sustainability, but also engages with suppliers, with local networks at the country level. And that's where the shared value notion of foreign and local is increasingly making headways. And my call would therefore be to support bottom-up growth of sustainability solutions and to give them a hand and to encourage them both through the many approaches we may have, hopefully, at Rio and beyond.
Georg, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can join with me in thanking the panel and other contributors to the session.
I didn't want to get on your coal business.
So, this is not a moment for a coffee break. So we're going to move straight on to the final panel. So if I could ask this panel to, with grace, go to your seats in the floor, and the third panel to come and join me on the podium, please.